Alright, time to start putting the gearbox back together. So I just spent a little bit of time getting a whole bunch of grease out of here. I had loaded up these bearing race areas with a lot of heavy grease, just in case that the stuff that I had covering this up and everything, keeping it out of the weather, didn't work at keeping the water out, or if I had to worry about any condensation. I didn't want a lot of rust forming in there. So I just cleaned out all that heavy grease, although that being loaded with grease isn't that unusual. You know, back in the day, the way farmers fixed leaks on gearboxes was they just let all the oil leak out and then they pumped them full of grease. And then they went back to work. There was a practical solution back then. Whether or not it was wise or not, hard to say. But I mean, a lot of guys did it. A lot of guys just gave up on trying to figure out how to keep these things from leaking. I am going to just go on the assumption, probably incorrect, that I'm going to be able to put this back together and put the gear oil in there as prescribed, and that it's not going to leak too badly. And then when it probably will leak, I may just follow the old-time farmer advice and pump this thing full of grease. I don't know. I haven't decided yet. So, anyways, step one is we put my steering shaft in. Now, for those of you who haven't been watching my series from the beginning, I haven't worked on this in a couple of years, but the last work that I did on this thing, besides taking the loader off and moving it closer to the house, was I basically turned my original steering shaft. Yeah, you're never going to see one of these. This is a IH350 steering shaft that has a tapered steering wheel. Where the steering wheel goes on is tapered. What this originally called for was it originally called for a splined shaft, and the steering wheel hub was splined. The shaft was in really bad condition. The steering wheel was in horrendous condition. It had a bunch of welds on it. So in the end, I figured, well, I could get a new correct steering wheel with the splines on it, but then I would have to either get another one of these shafts or redo the splines on this shaft, which was a non-starter. Also, these threads were all destroyed. So what I ended up doing instead was, and you guys can go back and watch those videos if you want, I ended up building up this whole area, turned a taper, and used a single point cutting tool on my lathe and recreated the threads. And then I sized all that so that this will accept a modern or more newer style, might even be an IH, International Harvester steering wheel, or I don't remember. But it's just a tractor steering wheel that will fit on that taper. So we're good to go, or we will be. Now let me go get the rest of the gears that go in this thing. Cleaning this area up here, getting ready for the gasket, and there's a mud dauber's nest in this hole right here. So trying to clean out the threads. Just lovely Pam dauber. Oh no, that was the star of Mork and Mindy. I'm talking about a mud dauber. Well, I'm trying to work out what bolts go where, because it's been a long time since I took this apart. And finding a parts list online, an exploded view online that actually has a call out for the bolts, has not been very fruitful. It's kind of a funky deal here with these bolts. This one was stuck in here just like this. So I have no reason to believe that I took this out and that this was in here the whole time. So what's interesting is this bolt right here has fine threads on it, and it's actually a stud. There's actually a nut on the back of it with a lock washer. It was in further. I pushed it back out to make my life easier getting this back on. So we've got a stud here with lock washers. With nuts and lock washers. Don't know why. I've got, in my parts that I kept all together, I've got 4 of these coarse threaded bolts. This one is shorter than all the others. And I think it has to be by design because of the fact that it sits. This one has to be inserted this way. So there's just enough room to get that in there. So I think that's why this one's shorter than all the rest. This hole is larger than all of the other ones, and it does not have any threads in it. And it goes through, it's not a blind hole. The only thing I have that fits in there is this nightmarish thing. Fits perfectly. The problem is, I don't know what the heck this is. This looks like, well, this looks like it's a stud. There's a nut there. There's 3 lock washers on here for some unexplained reason. And then this is all busted off. So I think originally there was supposed to be a stud that went through here, and then a nut on each side, and maybe a lock washer on each side. So that is to be determined, what I'm going to do about that. And then we've got this bolt here and these 2 here. These 2 here and this one are the same coarse thread. The depth of this 1, 2, 3, 4, the depth of these 4, actually all 5 of these holes is exactly the same. They're blind holes. However, where they pass through this half of the casting, it's thicker here and here. So that's these 2 locations. And thinner here and here. And here. So that's how I was able to determine that these 2 longer bolts go on the top here, because they have to go through the thicker part of the casting. And then this bolt is a little bit shorter, so it's going to go here, and then I'm missing one of these bolts for here. See this hole? This hole is another hole. It is not a blind hole. It is not threaded. This hole is supposed to have, I believe, this, which I had with my parts, which is another stud with a nut on each side, fine thread, and it does fit through there. So it's basically a mirror of this up here. So it's kind of a funky deal. They're using studs with nuts in a couple of locations. They're using a large stud with a nut with nuts down here, and then they're using coarse thread bolts in these 5 locations. Pretty wild. So the next thing I'm going to do is, before I forget, there's a lock nut on the back side here that when released will allow this stud to be turned, which the end of the stud is right here. This is actually an adjustment. So I'm going to free that up. And then there's another one right here on this one, which is the end play of this shaft. All right, I'm going to dry fit this thing on there. No gasket compound or anything like that yet, because I'm concerned about whether or not I'm going to have enough clearance to get this bottom plate on here, which is where the rack is, that actually engages this tooth and then is hooked up to the hydraulic piston that actually does the power steering. And there's shims that go in there, so I need to be able to access that. I don't know whether or not they intended for that to be done on the bench, and because mine's welded to the tractor, I can't count on that. So I'm going to dry fit this together. Just for anybody who needs to know, I already pre-assembled this years ago. All of these rollers, they have grease all over them. The grease is how you get them to stick to the shaft so that you can push this in and get them into the race. And these rollers, I made them. This was, if you look at my early videos on this gearbox was destroyed. This bearing had failed, and all broken pieces were in here. And this bearing is no longer available. So you got the only choice you really have is either, in my case, I made new rollers and I'm reusing the race. The only other thing you can do is just get a whole gearbox. So find a good used gearbox because I tried, and no junkyard would sell me any internal parts to this. They just want to sell a complete gearbox, and the going rate for a power steering gearbox out of one of these tractors that's not completely busted from a boneyard is around 800 to 1,000, I believe. At least that's what it was back then. I don't know if it's changed much. All right, so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 teeth here, and we've got 3 teeth on there. So what we want is we want the middle tooth on this gear back here to sit right there. All right, and of course the hydraulic lines are right in your way here. That's just wonderful. Okay, so now the $1,000,000 question: can I get that bottom plate on and the bolts on? Unfortunately for me, I have 4 long bolts this size and 4 short bolts this size in my parts that I had aside with this thing. So 4 of these bolts go somewhere else. I wonder where those 4 bolts go. But the important thing is I got to see whether or not these bolts are going to be able to be put in when this is... Oh yeah, there's plenty of room. Yeah, no problem at all. I got a mile of room underneath here. Alrighty. Hey everybody, it's Easter Sunday 2021, and I am back at it today. And I was able to find out some information. First, I went to the International Harvester Case website and was able to get the exploded parts diagram for the steering assembly for this tractor. And unfortunately, they do not show any of the fasteners. Then they have like listings where they don't have call-outs and they show just like bolts, but you know, it could be any bolt in this thing. It's kind of tough. So as opposed to like other exploded diagrams where they'll actually like show the bolt and they'll show like a dotted line showing what hole it's going through, and then you can look up the bolt and then it'll have the bolt size, and then it's, oh, okay, great. And then we'd be able to know whether or not there's supposed to be a bolt with a nut here, or is it actually supposed to be this funky stud deal, you know, like it is here. So I had to go back to my old videos from years ago, which are like now, I don't know, like 5 or 6 years old. And they're shot in potato vision. And I'll tell you, here's what I was able to find out. I was able to find out that indeed these bolts go here, these bolts, 2 bolts go here, this short bolt goes back here. There was a stud here with a nut on each side, which is what I've got in the back here now. And then there was a stud with a nut on each side in this location. And I remember at the time thinking, okay, that's kind of weird. Don't know why they did it that way, but they did. And then, you remember this mystery thing from the other day? All right, so what I found was when I went back and looked at my videos, I unbolted everything and there was no nut or anything underneath here. So I unbolted all this and took this out. And then after I took this out, when I was looking at this half, I could see something in the hole. And what I was looking at was that mess. And I pushed it out and it fell out. And this is what fell out exactly the way we're looking at it. Which I could see this is a stud with a nut on it. And then we've got 3 lock washers sandwiched in there, which makes no sense at all. And then I'm hoping this is a sleeve. So it looks to me like somebody didn't have the correct size fastener to go in that hole and just cobbled something together. I mean, and then on top of that, on top of everything else, it appears to have just snapped off. Even that looks weird. It doesn't even look like a clean break. It looks like, I don't know what the heck was going on with this thing. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go see if I can get this. I want to see if this is a sleeve. If I could take this sleeve off of here, then I could just find a bolt this size, or even another stud this size, to make up for this missing fastener down below. Well, I was able to remove the nut from this end of the stud. I cleaned up some of the grime on this thing and confirmed that this is a sleeve. on a stud. The problem is that I can't get it off. I used a bench block that had a perfect sized hole in it so that I could support the shoulder, this shoulder, and then try and tap this out. And no dice, it didn't want to move. I don't want to bang on it too hard because I'd end up deforming it even worse. So at that point, I put it in the press and tried pressing it out. And I put enough force on there that it should have moved. And it's a press fit, and a lot tighter than I would have expected it to be. So I don't think I'm going to be able to get this off of here. And even if I do, I don't even know if this is what's supposed to be in there. I measured this. This is 630 thousandths, which coincidentally is only 5 thou over a 5/8 inch bolt. Is it 5/8? No, I don't know. Well, anyways. So this, it's only 5 thousandths more than this size bolt. So I'm thinking, why can't I just use one of these bolts? This is the only one I happen to have right now. It's way too long, but I figured I'd just see whether or not it'll go in. Alright, so we get a clearance issue because of the casting. So there's no way that I could put a bolt in from this side that's long enough to go all the way through. Matter of fact, there's not much room in there at all. So what I'm going to have to do is, if I want to use a bolt, it's going to have to come in from the other side and be just long enough so that I can put a nut on it, and when I tighten the nut, not have the end of the bolt hit this back of this casting. Alright, so I pulled the starter out so that I can get to this backside of this hole back here. And the problem that I have now is that the bolt won't go in. I don't want to tap it to force thing because I'll just end up damaging the threads on it. But the hole's not lining up the way it should. And I think that's actually because of the weight this cover is. So here's what I think I figured out on this thing. And I don't like it. So remember, we got teeth on this shaft here. And then we've got teeth on this shaft here. This shaft is in a fixed position by the bushings in this casing, right? And then this shaft is in a fixed position by the bushing and the bearing in this case. So the mesh between the teeth on this and the teeth on that, the only way to change how much those gear teeth are meshing, in other words, how to adjust it for wear, is you actually move this cover. So it turns out this screw right here, which actually has a dowel right here that sits in this groove right here, apparently this is an adjusting screw. Now, you would think moving that screw in or out isn't going to move the cover this way, but I think it's actually an eccentric. So in other words, there's not like a cam that's offset on this side, so that when you turn this screw, I think it's going to actually push in this groove and move this cover around. So I don't know how tight this is, but oh yeah, that definitely did something. Huh. Well, that's going to be fun. So if this is in this position here, so I wonder if I can put that bolt through now. It still doesn't want to go. I wonder if I try it moving this around while I push on the bolt. Well, that's actually pushing the whole cover up. Okay. Hold on. There we go. All right. All right, so that's going to work. Putting that bolt's going to work. So that begs the question, well, how are you supposed to make this adjustment? Well, it turns out you're supposed to make this adjustment by actually making sure that the gearbox is... This is silly to me. It's saying that the gearbox needs to be full of lubricant when you make this adjustment. But to make this adjustment, you're going to actually move the cover position, which means you're going to have to loosen these bolts and then use this to move it to change the gear mesh.
Well, how the heck are you going to loosen these bolts without having fluid leak out all over the place? The good news is I might not have to do that at all, because the manual actually recommends not making this adjustment unless you've done a complete overhaul where you've replaced either this shaft or that shaft or both shafts, or the cover, this assembly here. So I might be able to get away with not doing that adjustment. So I'm back down here in the shop because I wanted to show you guys what's kind of driving me crazy with some of this stuff here I'm trying to work out. So let's start with the parts exploded view, which is right off of the Case International Harvester website. So this should be the official diagram, and I think this is the diagram that if you go to other parts sites, that they're all using the same diagram. So let's just look at, like, for example, if you wanted to know what size bolts held this cover on, okay, well, you'll notice it shows you the call out for the cover, and it shows you the call out for the hydraulic fittings and the O-rings and everything, but there's no little picture of a bolt. And I know sometimes they don't show all four, but usually they'll show like at least one of the bolts, and they'll have a call out, and then when you go in the parts diagram, it'll say, 4 required, because there's 4 of them, right? But they don't bother doing that. And then they do the same thing down here. This is the cover. I was trying to work out this whole problem here with this cover, right? And I wanted to see what bolts went where in this cover, and also try and figure out what the heck the deal was with that, that weird looking bolt with the sleeve on it that I pulled out. Trying to figure out what the deal is there, right? Now, I now figure that the reason why that bolt has a sleeve on it is because originally that hole was probably the same size as all the other holes. And that what happened was, at some point, somebody did a rebuild on this tractor, and they reamed out that hole and put in that stud with a sleeve on it as a dowel to keep that in alignment, to keep that gear mesh correct for the newly rebuilt parts. That's my theory anyways. But if we look right here, we can see the holes, and you can see there are no bolts. Now notice there's something right here that they're calling number 38. Okay? And then down here, there's something that they're calling number 50. And then over here, they got something right here they're calling 57. All right, well, 57 looks like it's in the position of that adjusting screw that I was just talking about. But just keep that in mind for a moment. 38, 50, and 57. All right, well, maybe we can figure out what those 3 things are by looking at the parts list, right? So there's going to be, each one of these numbers is going to correspond to a part in the parts list, right? Well, no. Because, like right off the bat, you'll notice part number 1, then it jumps to 4, 5, 6. Then we have something called null. 8, 9, null, null. 12, 14, 14 again, which apparently they used a different lock washer. I don't know what the deal is there. I can't think. So we want 38, 50, and 57. Well, all right. 38 is an adjustment screw, shaft adjusting. 50443H. I was able to look that up, and luckily I found that it was used in a Cub Cadet, and in the Cub Cadet exploded view of the assembly that it was used in, as luck would have it, you could clearly see that it does look like the screw in question that we were just messing with out there. Oh, actually, 38, I think, is the screw, the adjustment screw that's going to have a lock nut on it that is going to press on the back side of this right here. So I think 38 is going to be the adjustment screw that's going to thread into the back side of this cover and press on the back of this right here, and that's going to be the end play for this shaft assembly. So now I'm on to the next page, and we got 46, 47, 49, 51. No 50. It's not telling me what number 50 is, even though it just showed me it in the picture.
Then 53, and we go on to the next page. That whole page is null. And then null, 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 and then 60. So 57 also, they're not telling us. But look here on this previous page. Right here, there's another 50443H adjustment screw that they're not telling you about. They're saying null. So I don't know if that means that it's no longer used or what the deal is. All right, so now for more confusion. These pages right here are photocopied out of the IT manual that I have, okay? And I only copied the pages that directly have to do with this power steering gear. So here's a diagram that's supposed to help us label all of these parts. So they're calling this lever right here, this shaft right here with these two gears on it, they're calling this the gear shaft. So this is the one that the rack gear for the power steering actually engages with. All right, so they're showing it right there. There's the rack engaging that gear. Then here's the gear that actually engages with the gear on the other lever. Okay, the other shaft, which they're not telling you what it is there, but they mention it in the text. So notice they mention an adjusting pad. They're talking about the pad on the bottom of the rack because that can be shimmed to adjust the mesh between the rack teeth and the teeth on the gear shaft. All right, so that's an adjustment that can be made by shimming that. This is regarding the steering cylinder. We're not dealing with that yet. All right, here we go. So this is the section here that deals with the gear unit for the 350 Utility, the 350U. All right, again, we've got another diagram here, and they're nice enough to, now they're pointing out shims here, right? And they're pointing out the rack, and they're pointing out the adjusting pad, and they're calling this a gear shaft again. They're still not telling us what this is called, which we're gonna figure out in a moment, but they should have labeled that. But here's the interesting part right here. It says the steering gear unit used on models with power steering is the same as the unit used on models without power steering. And then it says refer to paragraphs 7 and 8 for series 300, 350, 350D, 400, 4, blah, 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 blah. And paragraphs 9, 10, 11, and 12 for series, okay. So, I see what they're doing. I need to actually pull the pages in the manual that I have for further back that show the manual steering gear and refer to those diagrams and paragraphs, apparently. Maybe that'll give us more clarity. Because what was confusing me was down here it says adjustment. The steering gear unit is provided with 5 adjustments. 5. The mesh position between the lever shaft stud and camshaft. So, lever shaft, stud, and camshaft. So this must be the lever shaft, and the stud must be that pin that's on there that rides in this groove right here. So, this worm gear must be the camshaft. The end play of the gear shaft and the power rack mesh position can all be adjusted. End play of the gear shaft, that's this S. Power rack mesh position, that's this shimming this deal here. And they can all be adjusted without removing the steering gear unit from the tractor. Then it goes on to say the mesh position between the lever shaft and the gear shaft, gear teeth, is adjustable. However, this adjustment requires reaming and installation of oversized dowels and should not be done except during overhaul and when a new side cover, gear housing, lever shaft, and or gear shaft are installed. As shown in figure IH350, the cam worm shaft is mounted in bushings and requires no adjustment. So the cam worm shaft, all right, so that is the cam. Well, I'm going to have to pick up a bolt that's going to fit in that hole that I was just talking about. So in the meantime, I want to put this assembly back on because there's no reason why I can't put that on now. And what that also is going to do for me is that's going to hold down this assembly, because right now if I want to try and rotate this, it actually wants to unscrew because it's just basically riding on that. I have to hold it down to turn it. So I'm going to put this on. So this has to go on with this round hole right here facing this side here, because this actually supports the bottom end of the shaft that goes up to the dashboard for the accelerator. And I'm wishing I had cleaned that up better. So I want to get this needle bearing. There's a thrust bearing in there. It's a needle bearing, and I want to get that out because it looks dirty and I want to clean it. So this assembly should pull out of this end. There we go. All right, so I'm going to clean all of this. Yeah, so the order assembly is this plug goes in last, this needle bearing, then this big shim. Oh yeah, that's full of garbage. We'll clean that all out in the parts washer. All right, I cleaned all the rust off of this area here so I can get a good mating surface for the gasket. I'm also going to use some black RTV sealant. When I wire brushed this, I made sure I vacuumed out all of the debris so that nothing would fall down in here and give me a problem. This cleaned up nicely. I got a new O-ring that I got to replace on here and for the other parts too. So I'm just going to put this on for now. Alright, that's all on. I had a heck of a time getting one of the bolts in. And then look down in there, it turns out there was another mud dauber's nest in that thing. Well, I guess I'm going to quit here for today. Didn't get much done today, but I don't want to put this stuff. I cleaned this up, and this thrust bearing is in good shape still. I know that this goes on like this, and then I know the thrust bearing goes on next, but I don't know how this is supposed to be lubricated. I don't know if this should be packed with grease before it's installed, or whether or not this ends up getting lubricated by, I don't know whether or not this ends up getting lubricated by the, well, let's see, hydraulic fluid shouldn't be getting in there. So, and the gear case is not going to have oil all the way up here. I think this is going to have to be packed with grease. But I'll look in the IT manual. Hopefully it'll spell it out for me in that.